Today's passage, which is the story of the feeding of the 5,000, is one of the most kind of well-known Bible stories in the world. In fact, I think possibly, aside from his birth and death and resurrection, this may well be the kind of best-known story of Jesus' life. I think one reason for that might be the fact that it is found in all four of the Gospels and twice in Matthew and Mark. No other story is like it in that regards. Two of the Gospels have the birth stories. Only one has the story of Lazarus being raised from the grave. Only one Gospel has the story of the prodigal son. But this is in all four, and like I say, is repeated in two of them, although the numbers are reduced slightly. We have the feeding of the 4,000. Why is it? Why is it the case that this is the story that's kind of in all four Gospels? Well, there are kind of at least two options for that. One is that Jesus only fed people once, but that the communities of the evangelists, the gospel writers, were so overwhelmed and taken by the experience that they then reproduced the story 6 times across the 4 Gospels. Or another is simply that Jesus just spent far more time feeding people than we have historically given him credit for. Either way, I think it's probably fair to say that this incident is obviously significant as well as being memorable. And much like the passage that we began this series with from the wedding in Cana, where Jesus turned water into wine, this is a story of a miraculous event. And so it's worth thinking for a moment about why it was that Jesus performed miracles. See, Jesus' miracles weren't done as kind of acts of supernatural power in order to show that there was a God who had such power, who was kind of operating through Jesus and that could, if he chose, just solve all the problems of the world with just a snap of his fingers. But rather, they were signs. In the Gospel of John, he uses that word, talks about the signs of Jesus rather than the miracles of Jesus. They're signs pointing those present as well as those like us who read about them later towards the nature of God and his kingdom. And perhaps the first thing to note then is the context in which this story happens. Immediately before our passage, we get the kind of rather strange tale of John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, and the man who baptized him in the River Jordan being killed by King Herod, beheaded at the request of Herod's wife and stepdaughter during a royal banquet in honour of Herod's birthday, with his high officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee in attendance. It was a banquet that was no doubt intended, at least in part, to show just how powerful and great Herod was. And the rather kind of senseless killing of John the Baptist was probably an attempt to display his ability to grant whatever wish was put before him. And so the contrast between these two events couldn't be starker. Whilst Herod, the anointed king and leader of the nation of Israel, God's people, was busy throwing lavish, raucous banquets for the rich and the powerful, Jesus was hosting a banquet of his own for the poor, the sick, the lame, and the downtrodden. And in so doing, Jesus is displaying something of the nature of God, a king who cares for his people and who meets their needs rather than merely stoking his own ego and sense of importance. We often speak about God as being a God of abundance, and that's never more evident than in today's passage. But that abundance doesn't begin and end with the food that Jesus provides for the crowds, but rather is displayed in many different ways. Firstly, there's an abundance of acceptance. We're told right at the beginning of the passage that the disciples and Jesus had gone away to a solitary place for a rest. The disciples had just returned from being sent out by Jesus to teach in the villages, and Jesus himself had been kind of teaching and healing seemingly quite relentlessly for a decent period by this point. So they were probably all in need of a bit of a rest. However, rather than getting some time to themselves and some peace and some quiet, when they arrive where they were going, they find that a large crowd have kind of rushed to get there before them and are waiting there for them as they get off the boat. I think it would have been really easy for Jesus to view the crowds as an inconvenience, to insist that he and his disciples needed some space, they just needed some rest, to send the people away. I think maybe even the crowds would have accepted that, would have understood if Jesus had chosen to do that. However, we're told that instead he looked upon them and had compassion. He cared for them and he taught them. There's also then within that acceptance an abundance of time that Jesus is willing to give. Again, Jesus, even when he had compassion, even when he decided that he had to do something with the crowds, could have dealt with them quite quickly and then sent them on their way. But instead, we're told that he taught them many things, signifying that he was willing to take his time with them, giving freely of himself. He even, after he's finished teaching them many things, invites them to sit down on the grass. I once had a boss who, in his office, he had his own desk and his chair, and then there were two other chairs in his office, but they were kind of turned around so they faced, their kind of backs were to the desk and they were tucked under another table at the far side of his office. It meant that when you went into his office to ask him for anything or to kind of, if he'd invited you into his office for something, it meant whenever you went in there, you instinctively stood, because it was a bit of a faff to sort of turn a chair around and get it out. So unless he specifically said, sit down, get yourself a chair, you just automatically stood in front of his desk. I think once he asked me to sit in his office. All the other times I just stood in front of his desk. And that then had the knock-on effect that kind of interactions in his office generally were quite quick. They were efficient and to the point. Because when you're stood, you just sort of, there's no sort of chit-chat, you just get straight into it, deal with the business and then get out of his office. I think he understood, as we all probably do on some level, that once you invite someone to sit, it's much harder to get them to leave. But here Jesus, rather than heed the disciples urging to send the people away, invites them to sit, to rest, to take time and just to enjoy being in his presence. All of which I think points us towards a God who provides welcome. A God who has an abundance of compassion, of care, of time and hospitality. So often I think we're tempted to view God as a sort of stern, strict father, a bit like the one portrayed in films like Mary Poppins and kind of films from that era, that kind of father figure perhaps. One who loves his children, no doubt, but who is to be feared and who keeps his distance, preferring only to spend limited time with them when they're turned out in their best clothes and they're on their best behaviour. But that's not the picture of God that Jesus gives to us. Rather, we get a picture of a father who delights in spending time with his children, who can think of nothing better than hearing all about their day or indulging in their games and their laughter. Jesus gives us a picture of a God who cares intimately about his people, who listens and seeks to meet their needs. And in doing so, he provides not just a contrast to those in power, but a challenge as well. It's a point that Mark makes, I think, as he tells us that the people are like a sheep without a shepherd. In other words, I think Mark is pointing out that those who are supposed to be leading and caring for the people have neglected their duties, with Herod and his officials more interested in their own status and reputations than in the people that they are charged with governing. And as a result, the rich and the powerful grew richer and more powerful, and the rest of the population were just largely ignored as they were deemed too unimportant to care about, in large part because of their lack of ability to do or to provide anything that would be of benefit to people like Herod and those who were in charge. How lovely it would be to say that our society today was no longer structured in that way, that didn't describe the world that we live in. Here, Jesus is challenging those structures, those in power, by providing a banquet where everyone is satisfied, in contrast to Herod's banquet where only those with access to the throne get fed. He's providing a clear message that the economics of God's kingdom stand in opposition to those of this world. And not necessarily because he's got more to go around. After all, Jesus begins with just 5 loaves and 2 fish. But rather because what he does have is distributed fairly. And so perhaps the first thing we need to take from this passage is, as people who pledge allegiance to the kingdom of God, we need to recognize that different economy that we're called to live by. Not just in our own personal financial dealings, but in the way that we seek to challenge and to change the structures that are at work in the wider world as well. And that then, I think, perhaps leads us on to the second thing that we can take from this passage. The second thing about the nature of God that this miracle points us towards. And that's that he invites us to take part. As we see in the passage, Jesus could very easily have just fed the crowds on his own. But instead, he chooses to involve the disciples, telling them, you give them something to eat. In the same way, I think Jesus today invites us to partner with him in the act of bringing restoration and reconciliation and renewal to his creation. And I think it would be really easy for us to look at the world around us to see all the multitudes of kind of different and complex problems and say, well, what on earth could I possibly do about all of this? In much the same way as the disciples reacted to Jesus' command to feed the crowds. They say, that would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and then give it to them to eat? In other words, they're kind of saying to Jesus, how on earth are we supposed to do what it is that you've commanded us to do? But it's worth noting a couple of things. Firstly, Jesus begins by asking them to bring to him what they have, which, as it turns out, is not very much at all. But just that little bit in the hands of Jesus accomplishes more than they could have ever imagined it would have done when they handed it over to him. And so it is with us. I think we don't have to be the most skillful person in the world, or have the most expertise, or the biggest budget, or the fanciest facilities, or whatever it is. All we need is an attitude that says to Jesus, take what little I have and put it to use. And secondly, whilst what Jesus does is miraculous and it met the needs of all those that were there that day, it was still just a limited act, wasn't it? It didn't end hunger for all people and all time. But that's okay, because it made a difference and an impact for those who needed it in that moment. And too often I think we stand and we look at what little we have compared to the vast, seemingly unending problems in our world, and we think, well, we can't possibly change all of that. And so we allow that then to stop us from doing anything. But I'm reminded of the story of a man who was walking along a beach when he noticed a boy picking something up and gently throwing it into the ocean. Approaching the boy, he asked, "What are you doing?" And the youth replied, "Throwing starfish back into the ocean. The surf is up and the tide is going out. If I don't throw them back, they'll die." "Son," the man said, "don't you realize there are miles and miles of beach and hundreds of starfish? You can't make a difference." After listening politely, the boy bent down, picked up another starfish, and threw it back into the surf. Then, smiling at the man, he said, "I made a difference for that one." Might we too be willing to entrust all that we have and all that we are to the God of compassion, that he might do miraculous things in and through us.